Hello, I'm the Unabridged Gamer, and this is The Dark Pictures, The Devil in Me. It's time to explain the game's story, and just so the terms are absolutely clear, what we're going to be going over in this video is the backstory of the entire game, presented in chronological order. We won't be talking about the events of the game itself, or presenting backstory reveals in the order that they occur in a standard playthrough. The game structure is designed in order to offer thrills and drama, not narrative clarity. This video will lay out who did what, when, and why, and will, for the most part, stick to things that are either confirmed or heavily implied within the game. More esoteric theory videos will be coming later. So now, please join us on a trip through the story of The Devil in Me, which will be constructed almost entirely out of spoilers. This is your final warning. The story begins with a couple, Jeff and Marie Whitman, arriving in Chicago on their honeymoon, planning to take in the World's Columbian Exposition. They make the poor decision to stay at the World's Fair Hotel, which is run by the soon-to-be infamous serial killer, Henry Howard Holmes, nee Herman Webster Mudgett. So this doesn't cause any confusion later. The game is set in a largely fictional world where Holmes built a murder hotel full of traps and killed the guests, when, of course, no such thing actually existed. Of course, there's something interesting about the power of the story of Holmes driving someone to crimes even though most of it didn't happen, but that's not the plot of this game. As far as this game is concerned, Holmes was a prolific serial killer, basically old-timey Jigsaw with almost 200 victims. After checking into the hotel, the newlyweds are quickly dispatched by the crazed killer. Holmes is executed by hanging. It takes him around 15 minutes to suffocate to death. He was 34 years old. Hector Monday is born to unwed 45-year-old woman Lucinda Monday in Silver Springs, Maryland, where he will grow up and she will live for the rest of her life. Not dealing well with the challenges of motherhood and perhaps being somewhat mentally unbalanced as well, Lucinda is a monstrously cruel mother. She regularly beats Hector, causing injuries so bad that they lead doctors and school officials to become involved in the case. Based on this note scrawled on one of the letters about Hector's injuries, we can assume that she did not react well to this scrutinizing of her parenting abilities, and it only increased her cruel treatment of her son. Hector survived this horrific childhood, but not without significant mental scarring. His mother had damaged his self-worth to the point that he considered her constant insults and judgment to be his normal state of existence. To a certain extent, we can assume that Hector Monday barely exists as a person. He's hostile to the entire idea of identity, wiping out the faces of people in a favorite book, and carefully destroying all record of his own appearance in the few souvenirs of his life that he keeps around. Hector Monday completes a degree in psychology at the age of 23 and applies to the FBI. He excels at the work, which is appropriate. It's not unusual for the victims of child abuse to wind up with authoritarian-leaning personality types, which tend to do well in law enforcement. He went to work at the Behavioral Sciences Unit attempting to profile serial killers. Lucinda Monday, now 72 years old, is moved to the Twilight Prairies retirement home in Silver Springs, Maryland. Hector Monday works on the investigation of the serial killer known as the Imaginary Killer, a madman with a strange MO. He kills people, then uses elaborate surgeries and mechanical parts to transform them into animatronics. We have to assume that the Imaginary Killer was never caught, as he's never mentioned when anyone discusses Monday's career. Sometime after this, Hector began the hunt for the Arkansas Beast, a serial killer who had been murdering women for some time. We have no clear information about the details of this investigation, only that after the killer, Manny Sherman, is apprehended, they credited the capture to profiling. As part of the BSU's program of interviewing serial killers to create an overall profile of the serial killer mindset, Monday begins interviewing Manny Sherman, hoping to discover what turned him into a killer. Unfortunately, Monday's lack of a strong core personality and hardwired vulnerability to more domineering personality types led to Manny having an outsized impact on Hector. Monday had spent his life being tormented by the mental scars of his childhood abuse, and he'd tried to cope with it by becoming a law enforcement officer, directing his violent urges towards a socially useful purpose, but he found it unsatisfying and could never settle on exactly who he was at a core level. His interviews with Manny provided him with an escape hatch. Manny seems confident and self-assured to Hector, comfortable with himself and his place in the world even as he sits in prison, waiting to be put to death. Hector begins to envy that clarity. During this period, Lucinda's health takes a turn for the worse, and she's diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Facing the emotional apocalypse that the death of his mother would represent, and with Manny Sherman's words echoing through his head, Monday travels to Chicago in order to give a series of lectures on profiling to local agents. Mentally tortured and near the end of his rope, he goes out one night, abducts a middle-aged man, and tears the teeth out of his head before stabbing him to death. A short time later, he went out and repeated the crime, although the messiness of the first murder hadn't been satisfying to him, so this time he saved the bodily mutilation until after stabbing his victim to death. This time, he took the victim's ears. Monday goes back to interviewing Sherman again, and the killer is able to see the effect he's had on the FBI agent, somehow almost aware that he's killed someone. He continues taunting and manipulating Monday, encouraging him to go for big numbers as a killer, and focusing on the idea that killing people is the fastest way to be remembered by history. Unable to face being permanently separated from his mother, he brings a tape recorder and encourages her to scream and swear at him as she had for his entire life. His idea of what is love had become so warped that he finds himself compelled to recreate the only attention he ever got from his mother, even though it was incredibly abusive. The recording has become so extreme that the head of the retirement home even formally asks him to stop making them in order to prevent the other residents from becoming upset. Around this time, he's called back to Chicago, this time to head up a task force investigating the very crimes he's committed. Police have attributed them to the Shoeshine Killer, although it's not entirely clear where that particular name came from. If being forced to investigate his own crimes weren't stressful enough, Hector's mother takes a turn for the worse and he rushes back to be with her before the end. It's at this point we get our first real point of contention within the game. Did Hector Monday kill his mother? The game says he did based on evidence that he was at her side when she died, but that seems like a stretch. While it's completely understandable that he would have motive to kill her, she did ruin his entire life after all, there's no real evidence that he did, especially because of the steps he took to keep from being separated from her. In fact, based on evidence that will soon arise, we can be certain that, if nothing else, he certainly doesn't consider his mother to be one of his victims. If he did kill her, the most likely scenario is a kind of euthanasia, with Hector ending his mother's life while she suffered in agony from lung cancer. While it might sound like a stretch to suggest that one of the conclusions in the clue board is wrong, there's probably factually incorrect information on there, although that can wait for another video. After the death of his mother, Hector's mind quickly begins to fall apart. His work suffers and he's sent to therapy where he's offered antidepressants but refuses to take them. He goes to see Manny Sherman one final time, but is so unsettled by the experience that he attacks the killer, causing Sherman to joke that he might be Monday's first victim. Little does he know that Hector has already murdered 2 people. Aware that he won't be able to keep his dual life up for much longer, and possibly not long before being captured by the FBI, given that his 2 murders were so haphazard and poorly thought out, Hector develops a new plan. Fake his death and disappear, then begin killing again using a more careful methodology. First, he travels home to Maryland and steals his mother's body, hiding it away so that he can keep it with him wherever he winds up. Then it's time to disappear, so he steals a body from a grave and switches its dental records with his own, then stashes it in an abandoned warehouse in Chicago. Then he brings a victim to his own apartment, allowing them to scream bloody murder as he brutalizes them, ensuring that the police will be called to investigate. The officer who turns up, one Carly Stanley, is quickly murdered by Monday, but not before he has time to report on the gory scene he discovers inside the apartment. Monday then leaves his car next to the abandoned warehouse and waits for the police to find it. Once they do, he sets the building on fire and disappears, confident that the corpse will be identified as his. The ruse works and Monday is free to begin planning how to become America's most prolific serial killer. Hector has a problem though. All of his killing hasn't actually told him anything about who he is. He wants to kill, but he can't do it as himself, so he needs to create someone that he can. Luckily, he's got a plan for that, inspired by his conversations with Sherman. He's going to become the new Holmes, right down to his pseudonym, Grantham Dume, which is an anagram for Herman Mudgett. In order to make sure no one figures out his plan, he has to tie off one loose end. With Hector Monday believed to be dead and the Shoeshine Killer's case closed, all of the case evidence is moved to a storage facility. Hector breaks in and grabs everything that the Chicago police took from his apartment, hoping that they'll assume it was souvenir hunters looking for serial killer memorabilia. By grabbing everything, his hope is that the police won't realize what he was actually looking for, a list of possible aliases he'd made, drawn from the life and crimes of H.H. Holmes. After Manny Sherman's death by execution, Hector steals his body as well, hoping to keep it as a souvenir along with his mother's body, commemorating the most important people who contributed into transforming him into Dume. Before starting his killing spree, he's going to need a lot of resources and an isolated location where he can operate without suspicion. He finds both when he learns of Mark and Jennifer Edwards, a wealthy, reclusive couple who live on a private island on Lake Michigan. The island was once the site of a health spa, but it had been long since closed and the couple now lives in a lighthouse at the edge of the island. Using his shallow, psychopathic charm, he manages to befriend the isolated couple and by 2011 either convinces them to make him their heir or simply forges paperwork to that effect. But here's the crazy part. He doesn't kill them for the money. No, it seems that he waits for them to die of natural causes a year or two later. It's impossible to say exactly when he inherits the island and all of their substantial wealth. Why didn't he kill them? Given their relative ages, it's possible that Hector genuinely saw them as substitute parents and legitimately enjoyed spending time with them while waiting for the opportunity to start enacting his plan. How can we tell he doesn't kill anyone else? More on that in a moment. Now possessing everything he'll need to make his dreams into reality, Dume spends the next 4 or so years having construction crews completely transform the old spa into a sprawling estate built in the style of the World's Fair Hotel, with the major difference being an access tower leading from the basement to the top floor right in the middle of the building. He even has some strange additions put in, such as a garbage grinder in the basement and a crematorium. Then, in 2017, Hector hires the K.D. Cooper Construction Company to do the final, far more sinister phase of the rebuild, involving vents for creating suffocation chambers and moving poison gas around, a speaker and microphone system, as well as a set of moving walls and trapdoors, all of which can be monitored and controlled from a number of different control rooms. Once the renovations are complete, Hector decides to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, both murdering everyone who knows about the adjustments he's made to the hotel and testing out some of the traps he's been working on. This is a terrible plan, of course, and could have never worked, but we can save that for another video. For now, let's stick to what happened in the game's story. After killing 2 of the workers, James and Bobby, and making it look like they'd left early, once the walls were complete, Hector invited 5 workers to stay on the island to perform a survey of what would be needed to get the spa up and running. These 5 people are Laura Murphy, Frank Hadelman, Jesse Clark, and the husband and wife team of Monica and Ryan Hart. After completing the last of the wiring work, Monday begins testing out his murderous plans. The first is a prototype of his choose who dies obsession with 2 people chained to a post with a buzzsaw inside. The game is simple. When the timer runs out, a ratchet will pull in both people, who will immediately be torn apart by the saw. The only way to survive is for one person to pull the other into the saw blade first. If one victim kills the other, they'll be allowed to live. At least for a moment. Hector obviously kills them immediately after the chain's release. The victims here were the husband and wife team of Ryan and Monica, and according to the mannequin reenactment Hector stages, Ryan killed his wife in an attempt to survive. Then Hector forged a letter of resignation to explain Monica's absence from the worksite. 2 days earlier, he'd left a note saying that Ryan had left to look after his ailing mother. Jesse finds this suspicious as he thought Ryan's mother had died years earlier. It's unclear why Monica didn't find her husband's absence more suspicious, as the 2 of them didn't get put in the saw trap until 2 days after Ryan supposedly left the island. Hector then stabbed Laura to death, hanged Frank, and stabbed Jesse. We knew the order of their deaths because Monday was careful to keep track of exactly how many people he killed, and these 5 are numbers 7 through 11, starting with Monica and ending with Jesse. Interestingly, this is also how we know that Hector didn't kill anyone that hasn't been mentioned in the synopsis so far, and likely didn't even kill his mother. His 3 shoeshine kill victims are his first kills, the cop makes 4, the workers Bobby and James are 5 and 6, so as you can see based on the number he scrawled on her ID card, Monica is number 7. Hector then dumped a body in the lake and faked a boating accident. Presumably this was Ryan's body, as the others had injuries that could not be convincingly explained by a drowning in Lake Michigan. Somehow he avoided being caught in an investigation into the deaths, and then spent the rest of the year adding various death traps to the hotel that he couldn't trust anyone else with. Presumably this includes the suffocation chamber, the moving wall, and the various acid baths and pieces of body preservation equipment that he uses in his games. It's then implied that Hector killed the rest of the people who worked on the job, adding secret walls and floors to the hotel by inviting them to a grand opening of the hotel, but that seems like a stretch. After all, who would go to a party on an island where a bunch of your friends died? We get no real confirmation that this party or the related murders actually happened, so this will be considered an unknown part of the story for now. Expect to see it in another upcoming video. Now that his death trap was well established, Hector set about luring people to the hotel and killing them. There's a 5-year gap between the hotel being completed and the main plot of the game starting up, and in that time he went from 7 victims to, assuming the counter on the wall is accurate, 178. It's not clear whether he's doing the killing all year round or spending most of the year researching sets of victims and then only killing them in a chain in the autumn, as he does with the 5 groups of victims we know about in the game. Given the amount of prep work that goes into these crimes, the second is probably more likely. I mean, it is the fall season, isn't it? We can't say too much about what Hector was up to in the 5 years spanning 2017 until 2022 beyond the near 200 murders he committed. We can, however, say that his mental state deteriorated over that time and he's quickly racing towards a state of decompensation, the point where serial killers stop trying to get away with the murders and just go on a spree, killing as many people as they can before getting caught or killing themselves. How can we tell this? Simple. The Hector Monday we meet in The Devil in Me is actively trying to get caught. He's going out of his way to seek out people who will be more likely to figure out that something strange is happening at the motel and who are certain to be missed after disappearing on the island. While we don't know anything about the victims that arrived 3 weeks before the game's main characters, we actually have a pretty good rundown of what happened in the last 2 murder sprees. The victims from 2 weeks ago were Harrison Lee, a famous horror novelist, his husband Louis, and Kurt, Cecile, and Thomas Hill, who were Harrison's publicist, his second wife, and Kurt's son from his first marriage. By checking out a notepad in Monday's office exploring the grounds of the garden and pool house, we get a fairly good idea of what happened to them. Harrison and Cecile were likely trapped in the suffocation chamber, with Kurt forced to choose between his wife and his boss. Was Harrison so effective at trying to break out of the suffocation chamber that he created the gap which could later be employed to save Kate's life? Cecile survived the suffocation chamber, and the 4 remaining people attempted to flee the island. Cecile wound up thrown off a precipice and getting impaled on this sundial. Louis ended up drowned in a dilapidated pool on the property, which Hector later drained to conveniently fish him out, which left just Kurt and his son Thomas alive. In an interesting twist of the formula, it seems that they were not put through the ultimatum sequence that Morello was, and that Mark and Kate can be. No, it seems that they got close enough to escaping that Hector had to resort to shooting Kurt to death as he attempted to flee. Thomas managed to briefly hide in the pool house, where Hector found him and executed him with a single shot to the head. Note that within the world of the game, Hector has just killed at least a semi-famous author, as well as a child who has a living mother out there somewhere. People are going to notice that they're missing, and people are going to start demanding answers. Despite this threat of increased exposure to his operations, Hector was even more reckless in selecting his next victim, Tom Morello, and his family. He made first contact with Tom through his publisher, so that's at least a couple more people who know the name Grantham Dume and can directly connect him to Tom's disappearance. That's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to risking exposure though. Unlike the Architects of Murder crew, who were attacked on the night they arrived, the Morello family was on the island for days before Dume made his move, and since there was no one to act as Dume, it's likely that Hector played the role himself, interacting with Morello directly. Who else could have kept up the ruse that long? This was an incredibly risky gambit on Dume's part, which increases the likelihood that he was, at least on one level, desperate to get caught. He didn't just choose Tom Morello because he'd written a book about Holmes, he was selected because he's currently writing a book about Manny Sherman. Hector purposefully created a situation where he would be interacting with the person most likely to recognize him, going so far as to send Tom the edited versions of his interviews with Sherman a week before the trip at the hotel. Of course, he didn't want to make it too easy, he edited his voice out of the interviews after all. While his face may have changed somewhat in over 20 years since he was all over the newspapers after faking his death, his voice may still be recognizable. As for how the family was killed, we can see from his notes that Hector had trouble finding a time to get Michelle separated from the rest of the family. Perhaps he was planning to use her in the ultimatum or suffocation rooms, but in the end it seems that she managed to escape and fled, losing the heel from her shoe and eventually the shoe itself as she attempted to make it to the dock. In the end, Hector did catch her, cutting off her head, then removed her eyes to use in the mannequins in the dinner table scene. While it's impossible to say exactly what happened next, the most likely scenario is that Hector put Tom's daughters Natalie and Bethany in the suffocation chamber, forcing Tom to choose between them. The younger girl, Bethany, survived. Francis, Tom's brother, made a run for it before briefly struggling with Dume in the pool house and winding up with his hand cut off. To his credit, he managed to flee all the way to the shed next to the forest homestead and locked himself inside before bleeding to death. It also says something about how long the Morellos stayed at the hotel before their murders. Hector had very little time to reset the hotel. He didn't even bother tracking down and disposing of Francis's body, which is a massive change from how meticulous he started off. With a short amount of time left before he needed to get the Architects of Murder crew on their way to the hotel, Hector locked Tom and Bethany away, psychologically torturing them by placing Michelle's body in the next room, playing the sound of her weeping on loop from a speaker embedded in her mouth. Yeesh. Then when the time came, he gave Tom the ultimatum to lure Charlie and his crew to the island, or watch Bethany die in front of him before dying himself. Tom took the deal and sealed his fate, while the family dog Connie fled into the woods surrounding the hotel. That's 2 semi-famous people in a row that Hector killed, along with their families and close friends. And in both cases, there are numerous people who all at least some idea of where they went. Hector is obviously closing the walls in on himself, whether he realizes it or not. There's no better sign of that than his next choice of victims, a group of documentary filmmakers working on a TV show about H.H. Holmes. Were they to die out there, countless people would know where they'd gone and why. While this isn't necessarily the last group of people that Hector will be bringing to the island, it's safe to say that no matter what happens to them, Hector's not long from getting caught or killed. That brings us to the start of the game story. At this point, the player takes control of the story, deciding who lives and dies, and if you want to see what happens from here on out, you can play the game, or perhaps watch the official Hoguru playthrough. It didn't go great. You may have noticed that a few big questions were left unanswered in the Story Explained video. How did Hector Monday know that the Architects of Murder were doing an episode about Holmes? Why was the curator freaked out at the end of the game? Whose hand is this recovering Hector's mask after he's killed on the boat? How can there still be a Dume luring people to a new murder hotel? None of these questions have a firm answer within the game, but have no fear. Answers will be forthcoming soon, but since they're extrapolated from the text of the game rather than directly supported by it, we'll be covering them in theory videos.
Hidden Object Guru here. Thanks for watching the video, and now since you've made it to the end, maybe consider liking and subscribing, both here and to Unabridged's channel, where he covers all of the hidden gems you can handle. Also, be sure to check out my new game Dracula Defense on Steam. It's the only tower defense game where you can defend Dracula. See you back here for more Dark Pictures content, but until then, au revoir.